Warm welcome. Great to have you on CNBC.
Great to talk to you, Dan. Yeah.
So let's talk about where we're at in this recovery. Obviously, we're seeing Australia opening back up, thankfully. Access to the global markets are improving. So where do we stand right now?
Yeah, it's really good. In Australia, in the domestic market, we're seeing massive growth in demand. With demand for leisure over 120%, the corporate market and the SME market's back to 90% of pre-COVID levels. So we have nearly full capacity, or more than full capacity restored in the domestic market. Internationally, a little bit slower. We're at 50% of pre-COVID levels. By Christmas, we'll get to 85%. March next year, we'll get to 100%. But demand is massive. We're having more demand internationally than in some cases we've seen before COVID, with less capacity, which is allowing us to recover fuel costs, get yields up, and actually to be able to digest that.
And before we talk about where we're going, let's just quickly talk about how we got here, because the criticism and the charge in Australia is that Qantas has had its, not my words, but had its snout in the taxpayer trough when it comes to receiving billions of dollars in aid and support and perhaps even a bailout, if you wanted to call it that, and yet the ROI for the taxpayer simply isn't there. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, well, so Qantas had reported that there was $2 billion in funding that came from the Australian government. But actually, when you break down that $2 billion, we got very little funding from the government directly. $1 billion of that was to rent our aircraft as freighters to keep the agricultural sector and the fishery sector alive. So we were exporting goods all around the world when there were no other aircraft flying. So that was a service that the government paid us for. We didn't make very much money out of that. The second component of it was JobKeeper, which was a payment subsidy to our people. We stood down 22,000 people. They wouldn't have had any income coming through, and the government across the economy put a JobKeeper in place so that they could get through this. And that was essential to them. But Qantas, again, that was not money to Qantas, that was money that Qantas passed off to its employees.
And the government didn't take an equity stake in the airline at the depths of the crisis, nor did it really set conditions about how any of those schemes or any of the money you received should be spent. So is that a bailout by another name?
Which it's not a bailout again. So, the government advertised on media all the way through it. Does that mean CNBC, if you had a government ad, have gotten a government subsidy and somehow the government should take equity in you? That's the exact same thing they did with us with $1 billion for service. There wasn't any money given to Qantas to get Qantas through this. That wasn't for some activity, either looking after our people or renting aircraft for us. I think every company in Australia that uses governments for activity could be classified as having a government bailout and could be in the same category as wanting government equity or conditions on it. No company would deal with the government if they had to put conditions on it just to get government business. That's essentially what Qantas got.
I spoke with Willie Walsh yesterday, the IATA Director General. He told me that we're not out of the woods yet when it comes to the aviation market recovery, because of course we're still seeing some issues at airports around the world. There's a sea of luggage, for example, at Manchester, labour shortages, there's also manpower and supply chain issues as well. Where do we stand when it comes to addressing some of those issues, and how long could it potentially take?
Well, I think the entire industry everywhere is experiencing this, and we're seeing some of it in Australia, not as bad as we're seeing in Europe or in the North American market. We saw it at Easter, long queues at airports, nothing like you're seeing in London, Manchester and Dublin and other places around Europe. And I think it does take a while. The system is rusty. Everything was closed down for 2 years. It's just going to take a while to get that system humming again. And it's a huge, complicated business. There's a lot of moving parts involved in it. And I could show that with what happened with our call centres. Our call centres were inundated, as an example, with calls 3 times pre-COVID volumes. We had wait times of, on average, 2 hours. Sometimes people were waiting up to 8 hours. Now, we put staff into it, we trained new people, we recruited, and, we're advertised for 2,500 people. We had 25,000 applicants for them. And the call centre last week had an average wait time of less than 5 minutes, with nobody waiting more than 20 minutes. That was better than pre-COVID because we focused on and got it right. The same thing we're doing with the operation at the moment. We're looking at where we have COVID sickness, having extra reserves. We're looking at where people have left the industry, recruiting more people in and training them. And we think that'll take us a few weeks to try and get back to where we were. Some other areas, I think it will take longer around the globe, it seems, because the problems are bigger than what we've been experiencing in Australia.
Let's talk about one of the other major headwinds that the sector is facing right now. We have oil tracking around $120 a barrel. I think the average price of jet fuel is about 140 right now, equivalent US a barrel. So significant cost input pressure there. How is that impacting Qantas? And to another point, how is this new deal with Airbus perhaps going to alleviate some of the pressures you're feeling there?
Yeah, so the deal with Airbus, I think, is a deal for the future. We're putting together a fund of $200 million US dollars, nearly $250 million Australian dollars, to actually develop a sustainable aviation fuel industry in Australia. We've made the commitment of have 10% of our fuel being SAF by 2030. That has 80% less emissions than traditional jet kerosene. It could create a sustainable aviation industry in Australia, could create more than 15,000 jobs. So it's great for the country, it's great for sustainability, and it's great for energy security. So this is a landmark deal with Airbus and an airline to do something as dramatic as this. In terms of fuel itself today, which is an immediate concern, what we're having to do is get airfares up to cover that cost. Our fuel bill next year will be $1.8 billion more than it was in 19. And we are seeing airfares responding to it. Internationally, there's not as much capacity as there is demand, so we're getting yields up and we're completely covering the increase in fuel internationally. And domestically, we're taking capacity down in the months of July, August, in order to get airfares up to cover fuel costs, and it's looking like it's sustainable. So we're comfortable that we can cover this cost, at least in the short term, and at least at current levels.
And right-sizing capacity, perhaps adjusting fares as a result as well. Alan, just finally, your outlook for the second half of the year, as we continue to see this recovery progress, do you see any major headwinds or risks on the horizon beyond what we've discussed, including the outlook for fuel?
Well, I think, the aviation industry, my predecessor said, was constant shock syndrome subject to it. So you never say never. But, the airline industry is showing how robust it is. It's gone through the worst crisis it's had in its 100-year history, in our case, 100 years of operating. And it's coming out of it, I think, stronger. We're going to get the airline industry back into profits. We're handling fuel a lot better than people would have imagined a few years ago. And the aviation industry has shown itself as being an important part of the world economy, and it's a critical part of people's lives. And I've no doubt we will sort out these operational issues in the short term, and we get the industry back on a solid footing as it was back in 19.